Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, the Khris Middleton episode. I mean, we've tiptoed around it. We shared some numbers last week, and now we heard some more thoughts from Khris Middleton on what success looks like for him this upcoming season. So we'll dig into those answers and share some of our own coming up after this here on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen of the day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on YouTube as well, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Bucks brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you will get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Camille, we have two preseason games in the books that Frank and I talked about. The last one Thursday night against the Lakers and some of what we saw there. I think we'll get to some more takeaways from the first two games overall a little bit later in the show. But as we mentioned, pretty meaty episode, probably, knowing the discourse that surrounds this player and his importance to this team. And that is one, Khris Middleton. He opened up to Eric Nehm of The Athletic over the weekend about what success would look for this upcoming season. And I don't think you and I need to build the case of everything we've seen from Khris and reasons for optimism, reasons why you're concerned, and yada, yada, yada. We've gone through it all. But I thought it was fascinating. And I think the most logical starting point with this was, when Khris Middleton was asked what success looks like, and he said not only playing 60 games, but anything below 70 or 75, I don't consider that a successful season for me, which I think a lot of Bucks fans would agree with, especially some that are on one side of the aisle. But they also probably raised an eyebrow hearing that, thinking, well, man, we haven't even seen you in the preseason yet. It doesn't sound like he's going to play tonight against the Bulls. And Doc Rivers said, I'm hopeful he can play Thursday against the Dallas Mavericks. So if that's the starting point here, I get how some Bucks fans are going to be inclined to raise an eyebrow and say, you sure about that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, if that is the bar that he's looking at of being like, well, that is what makes the season successful to me, I think a lot of people just look back and be like, okay, well, you played 55 last year, you played 33 the year before that, 66 before that. Like, we haven't seen Khris Middleton over the 70 game mark since the 2018-19 season. Yeah. And for me, looking at how his play has been, so on and so forth, the number of games was never a barometer for me personally of like, that's successful for Khris. But hearing Khris come out and talk about it himself of saying like, no, like 70, 75 games, that's successful season to me, just goes to show again, like there are people who have been questioning, if Khris can play, he's just sitting on the bench collecting a check, so on and so forth. And that narrative has always been just a little foolish to me. Again, it shows like he wants to be playing as much as he can. And he pushes against that injury prone label, which is something I know that on this show we have, and you in particular, Justin, have just kind of pushed back on like, it's not necessarily injury prone. It's been an unfortunate series of injuries that have occurred to him. And that's the type of framing that Khris had as well when discussing his injury past and just what he's gotten coming out of that. And I think more than anything, what was really important was that Khris has seemingly started to understand his body even more. And the reason that he hates that injury prone label is because to him, it indicates that you're not taking care of your body. And he's like, I take great care of my body. I'm doing a lot of things to make sure I'm able to play. My body is in good order. But just some unfortunate things have happened over the course of the last few years that have kept me away from the court.
And I know you mentioned he hadn't played in 70 games since that the first season that Bud was here when it was 77. I do think it's, and I'm not calling you out for this, I do think it's worth pointing out the percentage of games that he had played in really in that stretch. The year before Bud, he played in all 82 games. The
Mhm.
second time in his career that he did that, then he played 77 games. He played 62 games the year after that, but remember that was the COVID
COVID
shortened
year.
season
Yep.
where the Bucks I think played 73 games. So he played in 85% of the Bucks games that season. And then the year after that, it was a 72 game season and he played in 68 of those games. So he had this stretch where he was extremely durable and reliable for, 2017 through the championship year. And then the following season, he slips on a wet spot on the
Mhm.
floor. And it seemingly just one thing after another. And I think that kind of opened the door for him to get more cleanup work and work on rehabbing some things like he talked about with Eric again, everything that he would go through in the off seasons where it was just kind of a matter of managing pain and dealing with, okay, I know it's going to take some time for me to get my body where I want it to be, but I'm just going to have to deal with some of these nicks and other things in the
Right.
offseason. And I think once he had that MCL injury, then it just kind of opened the door for, well, it's probably time, and not to suggest he wasn't taking care of his body, but when the injury starts like that, starts to pile up or pile on at an advanced age, I suppose we could say, for where he was getting at that point. I think he was 30 at the time of that injury. You know what? Let's cool it down and let's get some of that cleanup work and work on rehab and some of these other things. So I do think that was a big part of it. And look, there's no skating around the fact that he has had incredibly bad luck, as we've laid out in the past. I suppose you have to call him injury prone. I just struggle with it because of how the injuries, especially the notable ones, came on. He slips on a wet spot in game 2
Mhm.
against the Bulls. Kevin Durant comes down under his foot against the Suns, and that prompted 2 ankle cleanups. Even the bad luck of the other ankle injury in the playoff series against the Pacers. So that's what he's been dealing with, but it is what it is at a certain point. And again, people are just going to look at the last few years and maybe not add the context of, well, wait a minute, did we play a full 82 game slate, but
Mhm.
just look at 68, 66, 33, 55? Like, this guy can't stay healthy. What's going on here?
Which I think is fair, and I think that context is great to have as well, to keep in mind that we've had some interesting seasons, thanks to the pandemic coming through. But again, I think that his desire to play as many games as possible, again, goes for the love of the game and how he views, how he wants to be out there. We know how successful this team is when they're fully healthy. We've seen the numbers when Chris and Dame and Giannis all share the court together and what that looks like for this team. And I also love the fact that Chris was talking a little bit about his role in this article with Eric as well, just saying like, yes, that's like my personal goal. I want to play in 70, 75 games, but I understand like if we win, that takes care of everything else. If I'm scoring 10 points a game and we're winning, I don't really care. Like I just want to get out there and win, which again goes into the team chemistry and thinking about how this team is constructed, with so much of the conversation being around Dame and Giannis and those two alone. Not much conversation going Khris Middleton's way, although he internally and as well with Bucks fans, and I think with some national media, it's seen as a big three here, with Khris Middleton as that third guy making up that big three. So seeing him also just say like, whatever it's going to take for team success this season, I am going to be here for, which I think is interesting here, given how much we've heard from Doc about how much he wants to make sure that Dame is comfortable and making sure that Dame looks good. And, Giannis getting his touches, so on and so forth. So Chris going in and being like, look, whatever my role needs to be for us to win, I'm going to do it. And I take him at face value for that. Like everything we've seen from Chris, I wouldn't think that he's saying that just for the cameras or just for an article. Like I think he really believes that.
I do. And, again, not to make it seem like we are overly one sided here and just defending everything Bucks and Khris Middleton, but there's a lot of context. We talked about it a little bit on one of the shows last week about Chris specifically, but I do think you have to really review last season and um, some of the more details from that and not just wash away another lost season or injury prone season for Khris Middleton. So we'll explain what we mean by that and start to take a look at tonight's matchup with the Chicago Bulls coming up after this here on Locked On Bucks. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Doesn't even have to win. $200 in bonus bets is yours for placing your first $5 bet. To get started, just head over to fanduel.com. All right. So I know we talked about this on one of the shows last week, but the area that I have the most difficulty with the discourse that surrounds Khris Middleton, where I get frustrated the most about being injury prone and last season and what happened there, was the complaints with how they managed him and handled his workload and kind of the slow onboarding process. It worked, right? Like what we saw from Khris Middleton to where he was in the playoffs to having him on the floor consistently, maybe not for enough minutes up until February, but still he was consistently out there. I think what gets lost in the shuffle a lot is what he was on track for. And he set that goal of maybe not in, those specific terms, but saying, 70 to 75 games, I think his exact wording too was anything around 82 games is what you want to shoot for. At the time of that injury against the Phoenix Suns. And look, the complaints over he played 15 minutes in the season opener. He didn't hit 20 minutes consistently until mid-November, where it was typically around like 16, 17 minutes. And then slowly started to ramp up. It wasn't until I think it was right around the Christmas Day game that he played 30 minutes. And that was the onboarding for that. And from that point forward, it was really all systems go. He was consistently over 30, mid-30s minutes. He played just about 39 minutes in that win against the Dallas Mavericks. Didn't play the following game because it was a back-to-back. And again, if that's the rule, I'm fine with it. If it means Khris isn't going to play in every single back-to-back, he's not going to hit the 75 mark of his, but he's going to be lingering around 70 games. You got 73 from Giannis and Dame last year. I mean, if you get anything in the neighborhood of that, you're ecstatic from Khris Middleton. But the larger point is this. Even with that back-to-back process, soft rule in place, at the time of the game against the Phoenix Suns, that was the 43rd game that Khris Middleton had played in that season. It was the 51st game for the Bucks. So he had just missed 8 games. And I think it's easy to listen to a lot of the chatter and what goes on with Khris Middleton and the certain segment of groupthink of we just think he's washed and injury prone. And you would have assumed at the time of that injury against the Suns, well, he's missed like half of their games so far and he's done these things or he hasn't been able to do this. And it just wasn't the case. You could be frustrated with the fact that it took a while for him to get to that 30-minute mark. Again, that was largely the medical staff and not Chris's decision, but he was available for large segments of that season up until that injury, and that just kind of wiped everything away. So my point in all this is if that's the same plan, I'm perfectly fine with it. If it means he's not going to play in back-to-backs, or maybe we'll squeeze in 1 or 2 or 3 of those throughout the regular season, but it means he's probably going to miss around 15 games. He won't hit that 70 number, but if you get high 60s for him, and frankly, for any player, when we look at the number of games that have been missed, last year we did see a tick up for some players, but who cares, right? Like you need him for the playoffs, and you saw in that series against the Indiana Pacers the reason why you need him for the playoffs. And as you've mentioned too, Camille, there are no back-to-backs in the playoffs, so who cares if he's not playing in those?
Exactly that. And again, I think something important to point out is that a lot of it is medical team and what they are saying is going to be best for his body going forward. I'm not sure if you started watching Starting Five on
I did
Netflix.
not.
So one of the things that was talked about was LeBron complaining on the bench to everybody who would listen that he was on a minutes restriction early on in the Lakers season last year. Like he was really upset about it. And he's going around like, I don't need to be on a minutes restriction. I'm fine. This and this and that. And the medical team's like, well, we're just trying to make sure that we're able to get you to the playoffs fully healthy. And LeBron was like adamantly against it. And he made a comment just saying like, yeah, the minutes restriction has been lifted now, probably earlier than the medical team wanted, but like I'm kind of convincing in my own ways, which goes to show again what is happening with Khris Middleton and how the team is managing his health and trying to make sure that he's good. It's not unique to the Bucks and unique to just Khris Middleton. Like LeBron is somebody who on the show was talking about how he had a minutes restriction. He wasn't happy about it, but he had it. And we've heard Khris Middleton not be happy at times about the fact that he is being limited in how much he can play. You can look over at Philly right now with Joel Embiid hasn't played in the preseason. And they already said like, hey, you're not going to see him in the preseason. Yeah. It's just not going to happen. We have a plan laid out for him. And we're going to stick by our plan to make sure that he is as healthy as possible. Like that is just how it goes in the NBA at times when you have certain players who, whether or not it's fair or not, have had injuries in their past. And the team is just trying to do what they feel is best to get that player healthy and to the finish line of let's get to the playoffs and get there healthy, which as we saw last year with the Bucks and Khris Middleton, him being healthy in that Pacers series was like the spark the Bucks needed to even try to remain competitive in it, given the fact that Giannis wasn't available and Dame was banged up after the first game and just not his full self. So it's one of those things where it's like, yes, it can be frustrating for fans. And as frustrating as it is for fans, it's even more frustrating for the players because they want to play. Khris wants to play. So again, when I heard him say 70, 75, I'm like, man, that feels high. Like I would have went around that 65 mark just because that's the arbitrary number the league has now picked as, hey, 65 games to qualify for end of season awards and so on and so forth. But to your point, Justin, anything in that range, mid to high 60s, I think me personally, I'm like, that's a good season for Khris to get that much run in this particular season. So yeah, listen, the medical team is going to do what they think is best for the team and for the players. And it sounds like Khris has also started to pick up on some things of like understanding how his body works even better, of saying like, I know this pain is like, I can push through. This is wanting to kind of take it back. Yeah. So, it's all about a managing game to try to get where you're trying to get to as healthy as possible.
Well, and he had said in that discussion with Eric too, that, he tries not to listen to the chatter and everything that we just talked about the injury prone label, but he is frustrated by it because for the most part, as his exact quote, I don't want to say freak accidents, but just accidents. And I think when you say injury prone, that goes to how you take care of your body. Are you lazy and not putting in the work? And that's kind of what we've been, talking about. I take a lot of pride in taking care of my body since day one. Since I've been here. So no, I don't think I'm injury prone at all. I've just had unfortunate accidents that have happened on the basketball court, which is a wrong place, bad time type of thing. So look, he doesn't need to convince you or I. He doesn't need to convince half of the Bucks fans. He doesn't need to convince a small portion of NBA fans. It's just the other segments of that group there that vehemently disagrees. But look, when we talk about keeping him healthy, and if this is the plan where you minimize the minutes that he's playing in the regular season, but he's still seeing game reps, the playoffs are all that matters for this team. And there's two final things I'm going to throw at you and get your reaction to, Camille, before we kind of move towards tonight's matchup with the Bulls. We've all seen the numbers about what were the best 5-man units last year and where the Bucks were heavily populating that list, and especially the old starting lineup with Malik Beasley in tow. But if we just focus on the three most important players, when they had Giannis, Khris Middleton, and Damian Lillard on the floor last season, the Bucks were in the 99th percentile. They had a plus 16 net rating. They're in the 98th percentile offensively, and defensively, they were good enough. It was in the 92nd percentile at a 109.4. So the point again is, look, it matters in the big games. It matters in the playoffs and really maximizing that health form. And I think the final thing to throw out here is, since you brought up the name, and not to say this isn't a straw man argument of, well, nobody brings up injury risks with Joel Embiid. They do. I get that. But that's the 76ers' best player and how much hinges on him. Joel Embiid, or I'll start with Khris. Khris Middleton since the year the Bucks have won the championship. He's played in 222 games.
Mm-hmm.
How many games do you think Joel Embiid has played in?
I would say like, what, 125, somewhere in that range?
224. So
really?
Nearly identical.
I
And again, one of them is the primary guy. I get Tyrese Maxey took a big leap forward. He brought in Paul George, but he's the guy. If Joel Embiid is not healthy, they're not winning a championship. They're not competing for a championship with just Paul George and Tyrese Maxey, even with a revamped group. Khris Middleton's the third option. They have basically appeared in the same amount of games. And I think, and this isn't just a homer in me, Joel Embiid's injuries are more concerning than Chris's because, again, as Khris said, I get people are going to push back on him, but they're freak accidents. With Joel Embiid, it is chronic and habitual. The knee issues, the back issues early in his career, the fact that it's already routine or planned maintenance that he's going through on his knee in the preseason here. I'm not quite ready to say red flags, but I think there's a big difference in Joel Embiid's health versus Khris Middleton's health. And they've played in basically the same amount of games for the last, 4 years?
Which is surprising to me. I definitely thought that Embiid would be less, in large part because he missed so many games last year. I thought that was going to like tank that number, but
yeah,
I think the role is important too, because for Philly, I think regular season, yeah, they can withstand a few games without, Joel Embiid, assuming that Paul George is healthy, assuming that Tyrese Maxey continues to look like the player he did last year at the very least. I'm sure they're hoping for a more internal improvement as well for him to take a jump. So like, yeah, sure, they can weather it. But to your point about the hierarchy, like that is their guy. So not having him on the court changes things up. And we've heard on the Bucks side as well that not having Khris available, even in training camp, there were certain things they didn't want to install because they were waiting for Khris to get there. So like, I'm not trying to say that Khris is not important, but I do think that, again, all the consternation around Khris Middleton and his health, I would understand it a bit more if there was no Damian Lillard on this team. But given the fact that there is, and again, Khris is important, but I just think that it's normally a little too much on Khris, where it's like, all right, like it's a little too much on him. And to your point about the numbers, when all three of them were healthy, I saw NBA University also tweet out just how Khris ranks amongst qualifying players when it comes to that shot making craft that he has. He was number one in mid-range field goal percentage, number one in fadeaway effective field goal percentage, and third in pull-up effective field goal percentage. Like everything plus 55% from the field in those three categories. Like Khris Middleton is, I don't want to call him a luxury for this team, but man, when he is healthy and ready to go, like you can see what he brings to the table, especially with that shot creation aspect of it. And having that next to Dame, another elite shot creator, is so good for this team. So yeah, whatever the Bucks have to do in order to try to maintain his body the best way. And again, just because they're holding him out of games does not mean it's going to work and that nothing is going to happen. It's just, this is what we think is the best course of action. So we're going to go this route. You can't predict injuries. You can't predict anything. You're just trying your best to put yourself in a position to be successful. And for Khris Middleton and the Bucks, I'm going to trust in what they had, because last year, seeing the plan that they had for him, although it might get frustrating at times, I'm going to trust in it because we saw him be able to get to the playoffs and have that performance, even with him having a big ankle injury before the All-Star break.
I know we're running late here, but one more to throw out there. How many games do you think Paul George has played during that same time period?
That's got to be like, what, 175, somewhere in there?
Close. Up until last year, you were very, very close, because last year he played, I think, in 74 games. 215. So again, I'm not saying there's no injury concerns discussed with either of those two guys. I don't think it's discussed at the level it is of Khris in the case of Paul George, and Khris has appeared in more games than him during that time period. So it's certainly fascinating, but it was even more interesting to hear from Khris Middleton about how he's going to view success this upcoming season. Mm-hmm. We have one more home preseason game tonight. I did bump into a few more everydayers at the game on Thursday night. So if you're there tonight, stop by the radio booth and say hello. But we'll preview that matchup with the Chicago Bulls coming up after this here on Locked On Bucks. So, Camille, as we mentioned, it does not sound like Khris Middleton's going to play in this game. They don't actually release injury reports for the preseason. So we just kind of find out either if Doc or either coach is willing to disclose, yeah, this player won't play or this player will. And then when we get the lineups released shortly before tip time. But I don't anticipate to see Khris Middleton. We're probably seeing Taurean Prince starting again tonight. I would assume the plan will be we'll see the rest of the guys for about a half, as we've kind of seen before. Thursday will be interesting to see how they coast into the regular season. But I think we talked about this last week with Taurean Prince and the role that he can fill for this team. You know, I've heard a few other season previews for the Bucks from those that don't cover the team every single day, and it's very maddening where you just think, like, guys just aren't getting, like, look, we're not trying to say Taurean Prince was the best signing in the offseason or Taurean Prince is going to be an all-defensive player or anything of that nature. It's just when you look at who they replaced, they have much more depth this season than they did a year ago when you look at who was coming into the game first. To me, the interesting thing is how many more wrinkles do we see tonight and some of those, okay, this will work. Like, I'm especially curious to see those instances of Giannis at the 5 and Taurean Prince playing next to him as the 4. Also very curious to see what the rotations look like for the young guys, as Frank and I kind of talked about. Andre Jackson Jr. kind of feels like he's been lost in the shuffle, and I don't know how much of this is, hey, let's get the Rook some playing time early and get his feet wet here because he's going to spend the bulk of the season in the G League, versus we really like what we see here, and let's see if we have something in the case of AJ Johnson.
I think if we see AJ Johnson as one of like those first young guys off the bench again tonight, then I'll start thinking, like, I wonder like what this means exactly. But I've also been curious if this is a thing, like the rotation for when we're bringing in the young guys is going to vary from game to game because they're just trying to see different things. But that's been really curious to me that like Andre Jackson Jr., Chris Livingston, Marjan, like when they're entering the game. So when AJ came in, was at the end of the second quarter against the Lakers, I was just like, oh, we're going to get AJ some tick against the other starters on the other team as well, with him running with the Bucks starters. So it's really interesting to see that. I'll be curious as well to see if DeLon Wright returns today. I know he said the injury wasn't major that held him out against the Lakers, but just curious to see if we see him today. And if not today, if we see him on Thursday. And this is going to be one of those, like, you're going to be like, what? I'm curious on the other side for Chicago. Do we see Lonzo Ball today?
Oh, yeah.
Because on Lonzo's podcast that he has, he said that he wanted to play in 2 of the team's final 3 preseason games. And one of those would be today for a debut, or it would be their Wednesday game against Minnesota. It's just been such a long road back. We've been talking about injuries, throughout this episode, and it's been a long road back for Lonzo Ball. He's been one of my like favorite guys to watch in the league for a year. So not seeing him for 2.5 years at this point, like it's been a while for no Lonzo Ball on the court, and he's an expiring contract this year. So I'm really interested to see if he gets some playing time today, if this is when he makes his debut back. If so, there are going to be even more eyes on this particular game just because of that injury aspect for Lonzo. But yeah, preseason, it's one of those things that test you on how much you've really been looking forward to basketball, because it can get really wonky really quick once you get those starters and normal bench guys out.
It was late January of 22 that they had to shut
like
down. Yeah, so we're going on 2.5 years. I'm going to be very curious to see that. And I mean, more importantly, I know it's Locked On Bucks, not more importantly, but just to add to it, I know we focus on the Bucks, but I am curious to see this Bulls group, because he's a flawed player, but I think Josh Giddey is going to be perfectly fine for them. I am very curious to see how that pairs with Lonzo Ball. However, Josh Giddey needs the ball in his hands, and just what does this group look like when you're just you made that change to bring in Giddey. Maybe you're getting somewhat close to the Lonzo Ball that you had before. You have some other young players that have really developed the past year, especially, but it still has the feel of same old when you look at Zach LaVine and Patrick Williams and Nikola Vucevic. So I'm just curious to see how that fits together for the Bulls this season. And if they're a team that, it's, hey, they're guaranteed to be in the play-in tournament, or are they going to be fighting for it? And what's the ceiling on that team? But from the Bucks perspective, yeah, I'm curious to see what the rotations are when AJ Johnson checks into the game. Also, I think tonight, especially, I really want to keep more of an eye on Tyler Smith to see some of those other things. I think he flashed pretty well Thursday against the Lakers in some of those moments, but seen more consistency from him. And again, yeah, when does Ajax check in? What does that rotation look like? Like, is it suddenly Marjan and Andre Jackson are kind of on the outside looking in? So,
yeah.
Look, it's not like NFL in way back when the third preseason game was your tell. Like, it's
Big
still
one.
You're still getting a half of your starters, we presume. And then from there, just keeping an eye on what you see from these. And of course, Camille, I mean, come on, Liam Robbins. I'm hopeful that Liam Robbins really flashes tonight, because when you get to the preseason, we do post-game interviews when the Bucks win. I don't assume they're going to offer up a Giannis or a Damian Lillard or a Brook Lopez in the preseason. So maybe, just maybe, we can get Liam Robbins on the show and we can chat with him a bit there following a win tonight. But yes, tonight at Fiserv Forum, 7:00, the Bucks and the Chicago Bulls. Then it is on to Dallas to wrap up the preseason against the Mavs on Thursday. And before you know it, the regular season is here. It is now 9 days away. The Bucks and the Philadelphia 76ers, those 76ers with Joel Embiid, Paul George, on Wednesday, October 23rd. That will do it for today. For Camille, I'm Justin. We will talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.